I'm Michael Krasny. I want to welcome you to another episode of Gray Matter with Michael Krasny, a weekly podcast of deep dive interviews. You can become a member of this podcast simply by going to graymatter.show, and that's gray with an E. We cover a wide range of timely and intellectually engaging topics distinguished by high-level content and technical excellence. And in this episode, our guest is Ron Elving, senior editor and correspondent on the Washington desk for NPR News, where his news analysis is frequently heard and often deeply appreciated. He writes regularly for NPR.org, and he's a lecturer and executive in residence in public affairs at American University, has taught there as well as at George Mason and Georgetown universities, and he's past political editor of USA Today and the Congressional Quarterly, and managed NPR's Washington desk from 1999 to 2015. Ron is a graduate of Stanford, holds master's degrees from the University of Chicago and the University of California at Berkeley. And I welcome Ron Elving to Gray Matter with Michael Krasny, and so good to be back with you.
So good to be back with you, Michael. It's a pleasure.
It is indeed a pleasure and a delight. There are a few people I'd rather talk politics with, and we'll talk about the elections, obviously, although in many respects, I always sort of avoided talking about the horse race sides of things, and I know you and I don't like to predict. We're often asked to do that because of our analysis, our proclivity toward analysis. It's going to boil down, it seems, to a few states and turnout. Let's talk first about polls, though, because I was remembering Hillary Clinton was ahead in the polls, and people are still kind of picking up on landlines with polls, and there are a lot of people who aren't even picking up the phones. How do you see the polls? Is everything saying neck and neck? It could be something very different than that, right?
It could be. It could be. Probably this is one of those cases of Occam's razor, which is a principle in science and physics, which says that the easiest explanation, the most direct explanation, the direct line of explanation is oftentimes correct. It just may be that this is a 1% election, both in terms of the national outcome and also in terms of the state-by-state outcome, where we could have a replay of 2016 and 2020, where several states were determined by margins well under 1%, under 0.5%. And as we can anticipate at this point, there'll be a good deal of disputing about those last votes, and it'll probably take some time to establish it. But we have 7 states that look too close to call. In a sense, that's not that many out of 50, but 7 states are too close to call. We could conceivably have all 7 go the same way. We could conceivably have all 7 go the other way, although it would seem less likely that at this point Kamala Harris could take all 7. But it is not inconceivable. And it is not inconceivable that Trump could take all 7, in which case this won't look like that close an election in the Electoral College. But it could still be exceedingly close in the overall popular vote. Hillary Clinton won the popular vote in 2016, and Joe Biden won it quite going away, 7 million votes in 2020. And yet that vote in the Electoral College was still pretty close.
And the Electoral College is where it matters, obviously. Is there going to be any impact to the early voting in your judgment? Republicans shifted on that, and they seem to be voting more, or for that matter, overseas voting, which is also kind of up for grabs.
That's right. And there's been, in the past, there has been a general presumption that people who voted absentee from overseas, whether they were in the military or whether they were traveling for business, were more likely to be Republicans. And in fact, the Trump family has, generally speaking, all voted absentee back over several cycles. It's a typical thing for affluent people who have homes in multiple places and who have business outside the United States or who are serving in the active military to vote absentee, to vote back in their home state, but to do it by means of the absentee process. Well, because of COVID in 2020, there was a general sense that everybody had a pretty good reason not to want to go to the polls. Everybody had a pretty good reason not to want to physically go be with a big crowd of people. And many of us had voted in recent elections where it meant standing in line for a long time, hours in some cases. In Florida, they had lines that lasted for 9, 10 hours. Some people stood in those lines in order to get to vote. So in 2020, there was this fear that with COVID being so infectious, there would be mass outbreaks of COVID as a result of voting. So a lot of people got the message that they could vote by mail or go early to the polls when there weren't big crowds. And so states liberalized their rules so that that was easier to do, either voting by mail or voting early. And millions did. But this time, interestingly, several states are reporting even more people are voting early than did in 2020, even though we're not under the same kind of COVID conditions as we were then. But people found out it was pretty easy, it was quite pleasant, and they didn't have to rearrange their schedules on Election Day or risk standing in line. So it's become quite popular, and the Republicans dropped their objections to it, which were probably always based on misplaced fears. But they dropped their objections to it and said, this is legitimate voting. Go ahead and vote any way you want, folks. Don't wait for Election Day if you don't want to. And so both parties are doing it.
Big question that has been looming in this election, and I'd like your thoughts and reflections on it. There is a sense of, can a woman be elected, gender and what role it plays in this election? We had a woman president elected in Mexico, which Claudia Sheinbaum, which seems in a country often identified with masculinity and machismo, a plausible scenario here, but how plausible is it? And also race, of course. There's the Bradley effect, which is still real, I think, isn't it? Tom Bradley, who was mayor of Los Angeles, ran for governor and it was lost and was supposed to win. And it was said that the reason he lost was people didn't want to say they weren't going to vote for him because of race.
That was the theory. And that Bradley effect has been widely cited ever since. To some, it was blown up in 2008 and 2012 by Barack Obama because he was ahead in the polls and he won. And he was ahead in the polls and he won by something very much like what was approximating in the polls. There didn't seem to be a last minute, oh my goodness, he's African American, or oh my goodness, he's mixed race reaction. There didn't seem to be any need for that at that point because it had been so much understood for so long what his background was. I think in Tom Bradley's case, going back to that campaign, remembering that campaign was a long time ago, there was a campaign billboard all over the southern part of the state, certainly, and elsewhere, showing a very scary-looking picture of Mayor Bradley and asking, will your children be safe? Obviously a racist appeal, and yet it did seem to move the polls at that moment, late in the campaign, and then, of course, he lost. So whether the Bradley effect was that kind of racism, old-fashioned billboard racism, or whether it was something more in the flaw, the polls will probably never be able to know. Now, the polls in 2016 were all pointing to Hillary Clinton winning. I mean, it was not a question. And I think there were many, many, many parties where people were popping the champagne before the vote was coming in on that night in 2016. A lot of people celebrating the first woman president when we didn't have one yet. And along about 9, 10 o'clock, it started getting a little soft in Florida for her. And then a little later on, we were checking the polls in Wisconsin and Michigan and Pennsylvania, and she did not have the lead there that she was supposed to be building up at that hour. And in the end, she lost all three of those states. Not whether she lost Florida substantially, but she lost the 3 Great Lakes states I just mentioned by very little, a tiny amount. In fact, putting them all together, you had fewer than something like 70, 80,000 votes separating the candidates, but she lost them all. And as a result, she was never president. And I think we've all remembered that. We've all remembered the overstating of Biden's chances in 2020. He did win. He did win the popular vote by 7 million. But here again, it came down to a very narrow margin in those same 3 states. Again, Wisconsin, Michigan, and Pennsylvania. And those very small margins made Joe Biden president just as they had made Trump president 4 years earlier.
Well, Trump still says that he really didn't win, and there's all this election denialism. And in fact, any thoughts about what might happen if indeed Kamala Harris wins and Trump, who has already laid some gangplanks, I would say, in terms of cheating and arguments of that sort?
He's been preparing the way for a very vigorous campaign of denial pretty much for the last 4 years. Back in 2016, when he won, he was talking about how he was done dirty, that he should have won the popular vote as well as the Electoral College, and he blamed it largely on the state of California. He said California had allowed unlimited voting by illegal immigrants, people who were not entitled to vote. There was never any evidence of that happening, certainly not of it happening in any kind of meaningful numbers.
Yeah, forgive me, Ron, there were 62 cases that went down in flames, in fact.
It was a textbook case of just a completely flimsy, non-factual argument, and yet Trump never let go of it. He kept saying he would have won the popular vote if there hadn't been for all those illegal voters in California. And he went on saying that, even though he had been declared the winner of the Electoral College and was there in the White House, but he went on complaining about it nonetheless. And you had to sort of wonder about that. But of course, he was setting the stage for 2020 when he did not win the election, did not win the Electoral College, lost by even more in the popular vote, and went right straight at trying to turn some of those states around. He tried very hard to turn Georgia around, called the Secretary of State, told him to find another 70-some thousand votes, called people in Arizona, tried to get them to hold up the certification of the election there, called people all around the country he thought might be able to change some of the states that had voted against him, and was not able to do so. All 50 governors certified the result, Republicans, Democrats, and the Electoral College was held just before Christmas, as it is every 4 years, in the state capitals, all 50 state capitals, plus the district building here in District of Columbia, Washington, D.C. And of course, the Electoral College vote was what it was supposed to be, indicating the popular vote results in each of those states. And that meant, okay, all done. Prepare the inaugural stand. Joe Biden's going to be sworn in as president. But no, Donald Trump still wasn't ready to accept that. And he had a lot of people rally in Washington as Senate Majority Leader or Senate Republican Leader Mitch McConnell said at the time, he summoned the mob. Trump summoned the mob. And he got a big crowd of people on the ellipse and gave them a speech on the morning of the day when Congress was to receive the Electoral College report and certify it. And he said, you got to fight like hell or you're going to lose your country. And so those people, many of them, marched all the way up the mall, marched all the way up to the Capitol, which was closed because of COVID, and they broke in and they interrupted Congress certifying the results. I think everybody in America remembers this, although some people's memories perhaps are a little short. And they literally kept the Congress from meeting for hours and certifying the results of the Electoral College. That is the famous January 6th attack on the Capitol. And again, McConnell said he summoned the mob, he incited the mob. And indeed he did. And indeed they came close to forcing Congress to, in some sense or another, set aside the Electoral College and have what's called a contingent election. And we can talk about that. But I profoundly hope that it never comes to talking about that, Michael.
Oh, and McConnell is still supporting former President Trump, despite the fact that there's great enmity between them and what you just pointed out. I'm just also wondering at this point if bringing up January 6th, particularly in terms of Donald Trump describing it as a day of love and so forth and talking about those arrested as being hostages, can be a real linchpin to, because it seems to be at this point, an integral part of Kamala Harris's campaign. She's sort of gone from joy to serious and gone to bringing up the fact that Trump has been called a fascist by his former chief of staff, by the former Joint Chiefs head. And I'm just wondering your thoughts about how well this is going to work with the American people. Trump's talking apocalypse and America's like a garbage can, and she's gone from joy, as I said, to really emphasizing all of his character defects and the fact that he's been labeled a fascist by those who really knew him well.
Scare tactics frequently displace all other tactics in the last days of a close campaign. I think if either candidate here were well ahead or even demonstrably ahead, even slightly ahead, you might be seeing different tactics. It's thought to be a better winning strategy if you're ahead to go a little positive in the end and try to appeal to people who are more in the middle and trying to soften the entire conflict with the other party. Because after all, you want people from the other party, whatever it is, to consider you at least. You want independence. And people are increasingly registering as independent in this country. In most every state, we're seeing more and more people deciding not to be either Republicans or Democrats and just to register as independents. So theoretically, those people don't want to hear a lot of harsh partisan rhetoric. But this is not that election. This is a close, absolute nail-biter. And I think it's clear that Harris and her team have decided that there are messages to be imparted about Donald Trump from people who know him best, as you said, people who worked with him in the Oval Office, people who were responsible for the functioning of the Oval Office, the White House, and the entire executive branch. Chief of Staff of the White House is an exceedingly powerful position. It is closer to the president than any other. And for a person like that to say, this man fits the definition of a fascist, and he doesn't have respect for the Constitution, that is profoundly disturbing. And you would think that there would be even more Republicans coming out, and there have been some. But there's a huge Rubicon here for a Republican leader, a Mitch McConnell, a Lindsey Graham, any of those folks. They have to consider, on the one hand, what they might fear in another Trump term. And all of those people, by the way, denounced the January 6th attack. They might fear what might be coming in another Trump term, but they also have their own political future to think about. They don't want Trump on the other side of whatever political contest they might be getting into in the future. They don't want to try to survive his enmity in the Republican Party, which has been fatal for many, many, many careers in the last 8 or 9 years. And so they go along and say, but I'm a good Republican and I'm going to vote Republican and I'm going to vote for Trump, and I can't have the Democratic agenda. The Democratic agenda is bad for America and Kamala Harris would be a terrible president. So they say those things, which they would probably be saying in any event. And, well, as some people say, they're just going to hold their nose and vote for Trump.
Well, there's one theory, and it may just be scuttlebutt, but I've heard it from a couple of sources as a rumor, that there's a kind of plan in the works to, shall we say, remove Trump, even if it means the 25th Amendment, and see to it that Vance is advanced and becomes the holder of the chief executive office.
That, it would seem to me, would be a remote possibility. The only thing that would make that happen would be if Trump were to have such a breakdown or such a physical breakdown, as well as an emotional, say, or psychological breakdown, that he could be clearly visible to his supporters as unable to continue. But if his supporters think that he is in some sense or another being usurped or overthrown or the victim of some sort of coup d'etat, they will react violently, I believe. And if not violently in the sense of what we usually think of violence, at least with political violence in the sense of holding anyone who is in any sense responsible for it, forever, holding them responsible forever, it would mean the end of many, many careers.
It's a tiny sliver we're really talking about, Ron, in terms of the undecided, clearly, but there's been criticism of the Harris campaign not being forceful enough, putting forth positions and not really articulating the reason people should vote for them, as opposed to voting against Trump because of his character or because of his being off the rails or whatever the language you want to use, or being a fascist. How do you see that?
That is an argument that we will be having for as long as we remember this election. And it's an argument that we have had about other elections in the past. If you are running against someone who you consider to be egregiously unqualified or wrong for the nation or for the office of president, do you emphasize your own positions or do you talk about why you think that your opponent is egregiously unqualified? That is a strategic question that could most easily be answered by saying, well, you do both. And Kamala Harris has tried to do both. She certainly tried to be positive at her own convention. And then for those several weeks thereafter, there was a introduce you to Kamala sort of period, because after all, she had not really been a household name until she came into the picture as a vice president. And even then, vice presidents, generally speaking, are in the background most of the time. That's how presidents prefer it. They don't want to share the spotlight with their vice president very much. Even the ones who have been relatively important in policymaking, like Dick Cheney in George W. Bush's administration, or Al Gore and Bill Clinton's 8 years in the White House, even those very prominent vice presidents are generally one step or two in the background. And that's because the president doesn't want there to be any confusion about who's president. Certainly Joe Biden didn't want that confusion. So Kamala Harris was kept a little under wraps for most of the last 4 years. So she had to be introduced, and she did all she could, I think, in that period of time to tell people a little bit about her without shifting the emphasis because she ultimately thought that the emphasis belonged, as I think Joe Biden did in 2020, the emphasis belonged not so much on the Democratic alternative, but on the personality and the nature and the policies of Donald Trump.
Is it possible that there may be a kind of unspoken and unrealized sense of people just being sort of tired of Trump because of all the vindictive pettiness and really all the chaos that has been associated with him?
One might think that certainly would be a theory that would be advanced if there were to be some serious deterioration of his position in the last 10 days. There might be just an overload. There might finally be too much Trump. But what he has succeeded in doing ever since he left the world of hotels and golf courses and casinos to get into politics, he really did it by getting on television on that Apprentice program that he had that was so popular, and the Celebrity Apprentice. And that really made people see him as a kind of mythic media figure. And it was called a reality show, but like other reality shows, it was far from spontaneous. It was a very carefully presented image of a tycoon and his business acumen. So that was all fiction, and it was done in such a way as to make him seem the ideal executive. So then he goes from that to the birther conspiracy and going after Obama on the false assertion that he was not born in the United States, and then riding that into a kind of notoriety with some people on the right politically and some people who were just following his celebrity. And then in a huge field of 16 candidates in 2016, he emerged as the one who generated the most interest, the most media interest. He was always at the center of the stage. He was always the one in the lead or in the headline of the stories the next day. And that has really continued all through the last 8 years. Whenever Trump's in the picture, he's at the center of the picture. Whenever he's in the story, he's the lead of the story. And he's the most powerful personality in politics today, and certainly a much clearer, powerful personality than Kamala Harris. So she either has to compete by saying, no, really, I have a lot to say on my own, or compete by saying, that man in the center of attention that you're looking at is dangerous. And it's pretty clear which way they've decided to go.
Unless we forget, The Apprentice was preceded by The Art of the Deal. Tony Schwartz has said mea culpa many times for the creation of Donald Trump as a major figure in American politics. Is it possible that he could, this is another kind of scuttlebutt rumor, but declare victory before the results are in?
Oh, I think he will declare victory on Monday night, or Tuesday night, rather, November 5th. Maybe on Monday night too, actually, Michael. But on Tuesday night, by the way, the whole Trump campaign is striking a positive, confident, we've got this in the bag. It's done. It's cooked. It's baked. And they're striking that pose. And so, yeah, maybe the night before the election, he'll be saying, okay, we're pretty confident we've won. The early voting is all going our way. He won't know that, but he'll be saying that. And on the actual night of November 5th, I would be very shocked if he does not come out and say, I've clearly won. He tried to do that in 2020, when, as we know, he wasn't even going to win the Electoral College or be even close to winning the Electoral College in terms of just number of states. Some of the states were very close margins, but Joe Biden went over 300 Electoral College votes. But Trump was out there saying he won on election night, and he had no indication that he had, but he went out and said it anyway. And this time around, I think it's all the more likely that he will. And whether or not that turns out to be true, he will be saying that on election night.
I'm talking with Ron Elving, who is one of the great political analysts of our time. I don't want to embarrass him because he's a humble man, but I'll say what I feel, as I always try to do. And we're talking about the elections, and it's hard to talk about the elections without wondering about what role foreign governments are playing, especially the Russians. There was an impeachment that didn't work, which was called the Russian hoax ultimately, but Russia did play a role. We really don't even know to what extent that role resonates now. There was apparently recently a revelation that Tim Walz was described as a pedophile and something that was really out of the Russian attempt to undermine this election. It's been pretty much corroborated. Read a couple of articles on that. But how can we gauge this, or can we gauge this? Can we really know what they're doing?
It's exceedingly difficult. The world of international intelligence is a murky, murky world. And our own intelligence agencies, the U.S. intelligence agencies, who have worked very hard to understand what other countries are doing, are not always sure exactly what they're seeing and where it's coming from. Now, they have told us that there are Iranian hackers. They've told us there are Chinese hackers and Russian hackers, all basically working they're checking the locks, let's put it that way. They're going around to websites, they're going around to voting systems, they're doing what they can to see where they can penetrate. Most of the indications are that all of these systems, U.S. intelligence agencies say that the voting system itself, the counting of votes, will be secure. But we live in the age of social media, and everyone is a media producer. And a remarkable number of people have access to AI, artificial intelligence, generated fakes and imitations, both for visuals and for audio. And so highly skilled people, and in this case, the intelligence agencies are telling us they were Russians, can make something sound like Tim Walz. And they can make something look like it was a highly respectable report on Tim Walz when it was nothing but a fabrication done by Russian spies, essentially. People who were doing this to hurt Tim Walz or to hurt the Harris-Walz campaign. I don't think it's any secret that there has been an affinity between President Trump in his day and in office and President Putin. They've said nice things about each other. Donald Trump has made it very clear he's ready to settle the Ukraine war on Russian terms. He had described the Russian strategy as really smart.
And excuse me, Ron, you got the Woodward book now, which says that they actually talked a number of times.
7 times after Trump left office.
He got COVID tests from Trump that were sent to Putin.
Yes, he apparently sent him some very precious, high-quality COVID tests at a time when they weren't readily available everywhere in the United States. And then there was just this willingness, essentially, to take Putin's view of the entire Ukrainian question and essentially see it as part of Russia. So that's shocking to a lot of people in this country, a lot of people in Europe, but that's where we are. And again, our intelligence agencies told us after 2016 that the Russians had been very actively attempting to be players in the 2016 election, not necessarily in cooperation directly with the Trump campaign, but just to hurt Hillary Clinton, whom Vladimir Putin regarded in extremely negative light and saw as a threat to him. So he did what he could. His agencies did what they could. And both people working directly for the government, people being encouraged by the government, sometimes in Russia, sometimes from other platforms around the world, did what they could to damage Hillary Clinton in 2016. Since then, I think people have become much more aware of the possibilities of this. Also, we have Iranian hackers who have been working pretty hard to get access to American systems and also to generate false messages to undermine people's confidence in just the voting system in general. I think that's been the commonality among all of the foreign actors who have tried to interfere. It's not so much to help one candidate or another as to discredit American democracy.
They also want to get back at Trump, the Iranians, because of Soleimani, don't they?
Well, that's right. That's one, if you will, assassination by drone that they have never been able to actually get back at us for and have their revenge. But beyond that, there's also just a sense, because we have been so critical of the, quote, elections or, quote, free elections, unquote, in Russia, Iran, and China, that they want to be able to say, oh, yeah, you think you guys are so democratic, you think you're so smug, and your elections are so impervious? Well, we're going to show you, and they're going to do everything they can to undermine the confidence that Americans have in their own system.
What if you have any thoughts about talking about AI and about the uses of the internet and so forth? But I was struck by these ads that came on during National Football League games about Kamala Harris in 2019 talking about transition surgery being taxpayer paid for undocumented and incarcerated. It's a bit of a kerfuffle, but it really blew up in some ways. Joe Scarborough even got in the action, talked about Trump doing the same thing. What kind of an impact does something like that have? I mean, a lot of particularly, shall we say, working class people don't like the idea of taxpayer money going for People in general. I wouldn't want to single out the working class. That's my roots. That there's something really wrong with that, and it should be looked down upon, rejected.
There's a double whammy in those ads and in those arguments, because if you aren't offended by the idea that someplace somebody is changing their gender or having their gender acknowledged to be what they see it as being physically acknowledged to be, if that's not offensive enough to you, how about the idea that it's being paid for with your tax money? Is that offensive to you? And then how about it's really a triple whammy, because then we say it's all being done for illegal immigrants. Now, I mean, we are talking about a truly marginal de minimis number of cases, but it's the principle of the thing from the standpoint of people who are offended. And why in the world would we be doing this for a person who is an illegal immigrant in the first place? And so any hint that that was what was intended is going to be arresting, I think, for many voters, whatever class they may be in, however they make a living. I can imagine people being rather startled by that information, or startled by the implication or the inference that they're taking from that information. And so they're effective ads. I was a little surprised that in 2024, there would be quite such an emphasis, as we have seen in the Trump campaign, on all things LGBTQIA, and they nonetheless, that's where they chose to go. Certainly, they're still hitting immigration, and certainly they're still hitting inflation. And those are legitimate issues, of course. But I was a little surprised that they decided that there was hay to be made, and certainly they're working very hard at making that hay out of people's fears, essentially, with regard to transgender, but also to all things LGBTQ.
Our guest again is Ron Elving, and let me go to some of your questions, much more that I want to talk about with Ron, but I have a lot of questions coming in, and this is one from Jennifer in Miami, who says, how much responsibility should the Democratic Party accept for the fact that half the country is willing to vote for what she describes as a nutcase over any of their options? Is part of their problem overreach of federal power and wokenness?
Certainly that last word, wokenness, has given a certain number of people pause. The Democrats in recent years, and certainly this was not historically the case, but in recent years, the Democrats have increasingly been the political party, I should say, of movements, liberation movements, rights movements. Certainly it started with the civil rights movement, and that was the 50s and the 60s, and in a very real sense continues today. The civil rights movement was very encouraging to the women's rights movement, the women's liberation movement, as I remember it in my youth. We called it the women's liberation movement. And then, of course, we moved on to other groups that felt that they had been under-recognized and suppressed, and who had a case to be made. And with each succession of broader definitions of rights, broader recognition, I should say, of rights, and really broader assertions of people's rights, there was a little more and a little more and a little more pushback from people who weren't comfortable with it. And I think the Democratic Party has often, and we saw a lot of this in 2020 after the George Floyd murder and the talk about restraining the police, there was a great deal of sense that if you wanted to get ahead in Democratic politics, you had to be out front on all of these movements and all of this notion of how we moved on from our repressive, male-dominated past. And that became a kind of orthodoxy, at least among some progressive Democrats. And that then eventually led to some loss of connection to working class people, and use that phrase, middle class people, folks who really just wanted to hear more about how to make their neighborhood safe. They weren't all that interested necessarily in cutting edge social policy change. And that, I think, has separated the Democrats from much of their traditional base, which was more economics based. It was people who felt that their forebears got ahead in the New Deal, which they did, and people who felt that they did better in Democratic administrations, and they did, and people who benefited from labor unions, which they did. But when those issues were settled in a sense, and when middle class, working class people had gotten ahead, Then the Democrats started talking more about all of these progressive social change movements, and that gave people pause. And I don't mean just one particular kind of people or just white people or just Catholics. I really mean across the board. An awful lot of folks who had thought of themselves as liberals and through many decades of their lives had felt themselves to be quite liberal, found themselves kind of stopped and shrugging their shoulders and going, well, no, wait a minute. I'm not sure I'm comfortable with that. So no surprise then, that's where the Trump people are going. That's where the votes are.
Question from Ben in Allentown, Pennsylvania. Is anyone really making a decision now, or do they just not want to tell pollsters? Does that affect poll accuracy?
Excellent question, and we just can't know. I mean, people have gotten to the point now where they don't seem to be even telling pollsters if they're undecided. They just want to get rid of the pollster, or they just refuse to cooperate, or they don't answer the telephone, or they don't answer the questions. I think we're overpolled, let's put it that way. When there were only a handful of polls and they were being done largely face-to-face, that's a couple of generations ago, then when they were being done by random digit dialing using landlines, you had some idea that people might actually feel honored to be asked the polling questions by a polling organization they had heard of, such as Gallup or Roper. That was a long time ago. Now we have polls being done by so many different kinds of people that it's hard to keep track of all the polls that are being done. And there are polling organizations that try to do exactly that. They do try to keep track of it. They do try to cover all of the polls that are being done and aggregate them. There's 538.com. There's realclearpolitics.com. There's 270 to win. There's the Huffington Post. There are lots of people that aggregate polls and average polls, and they're taking in so many, trying to hold out, the ones that really don't have any kind of scientific basis at all, but taking a general attitude of you all come, we'll crank it all into the machine, and we'll show some preference for certain polls over others as being more reliable or more accurate or more carefully done. But generally just saying, we're going to throw all these polls in the hopper and see how they average out.
Here's Reed, Santa Rosa. Our politicians and many of the general population seem not to sense the urgency of the climate situation. Without broad support in Congress, how else can meaningful policies be enacted with the long-term vision required?
Well, yes, indeed. I teach at American University here in Washington, D.C., and we just had a conference a week ago today on climate change, and the title we put on it was, "Why Aren't the Politicians Talking More About Climate Change in This Election?" And, we spent a whole day wrestling with those questions. The simple bottom line is that's not where enough of the undecided voters are. People who really know the issue of climate change are probably not undecided at this particular time. And so if you're a campaign and you're trying to spend your money on talking about the issues that people might be persuadable on, you go somewhere else. That's a pity, because there's no more important issue before the government or before the nation, before each of us as individuals, than the survival of our planet. And if you believe that climate change is real, and you see all the manifestations of it and realize where it's going and how progressive it can be, there's no more important issue. But it's not where the votes are right now.
Another question from Will in Los Angeles.
And by the way, if I might say, Michael,
yeah,
if I might say, if people want to really explore this topic, they should really take a look at this symposium that we just had on this question. I think they can find that just by going to american.edu. That's the American University website, and there are links there to the conference, and the whole thing is there on tape. I'm
glad you're talking about it in the classrooms and at American University, because it virtually hasn't even come up in the election. Will from Los Angeles wants to know about ballot initiatives. Do they affect voting? In my state, the national election is essentially decided, but I voted early because of initiatives.
And that issue might have been abortion.
Yeah.
That is the issue that has proven to be capable. And I'm not putting words in the mouth of the caller or the questioner, but it's probably abortion because.
Well, he's in California, so it may not be, but.
Okay, so I don't think it is on the ballot in California.
In many other states, it may be, yeah.
And some of those states, Florida, for example, have been swing states in the past, not a swing state at this moment, but it's a live issue in Florida and will be in the years to come. I think it'll be a very live issue in Florida in the years to come. Not only because the Dobbs decision took away the constitutional nationwide right to choose, but also because the states have gone in so many different directions and so many gradations. of severity in terms of denying the right to choose. So Florida is pretty egregious, and there's going to be a vote in Florida that we can't predict. We have been stunned, I must say. I went to high school in Kansas, and I was quite surprised when shortly after Dobbs, Kansas had a referendum and voted to restore essentially Roe versus Wade-like rights to reproductive decision-making to women pretty substantially. I mean, it wasn't a squeaker. And that shocked a lot of folks because Kansas is not exactly thought of as, California Central. It's California on Central Time. And yet, those were the votes. And they were votes not just all in the more urban areas, but throughout the state. So we've seen that in state after state, Kentucky and others, where it was surprising the degree to which people showed up to support abortion rights. I believe Missouri has such a question on their ballot this November. And Missouri, of course, is no longer a swing state either. It's become quite a red state and is really dominated now by Republicans. But that may not necessarily show up in their vote on a woman's right to choose.
I want to talk to you about the states and about Congress and what's likely to happen. But first, I wanted to get to something else, and that is the economy. A lot of talk from Trump about tariffs, and all these Nobel Prize-winning economists have come out and essentially backed tariffs. How much of a role does that play?
You have to really wonder if it really matters that much to anyone whose mind is not already made up. I think if you had, let's say a 2012 kind of election between Obama and Mitt Romney, the Republican nominee that year, there might be a fair number of people who were very seriously thinking about voting for Mitt Romney, but would be still open to something like these Nobel economists saying bad things about his economic plan. I doubt very much they would have said that about Mitt Romney's economic plan, but they have said it about Trump's. There's also a survey. I think this is an undercovered bit of academic influence. There's a survey done, and has been done for a number of years, every 2 years. They ask members of the American Historical Society, Presidential Studies Society, and they are chosen, a couple hundred of them, and they're chosen to be as representative as possible from left to right of different political spectrum viewpoints. And these folks have regularly ranked the presidents. This goes back a generation or two. They do it every 2 years. And now for 2 rounds of voting running in a row, they have almost, well, it's not unanimous by any means, but overwhelmingly named Donald Trump the single worst president in U.S. history. Now, that doesn't get much attention, I suppose, because it does sound so extreme that people say, oh, well, that must just be a bunch of egghead professors someplace. But these are people who represent many different points of view on American history, from left to right. And they have come to a consensus that Trump was not a good president. In fact, he was an egregiously bad president in the 4 years he's been in office, stacked against every other president we've had. So that, it seems to me, is something that people might want to at least crank into their consideration. I would also say that the Nobel Prize-winning economist saying something so, well, crystal clear cut in preference for one candidate over the other would be meaningful to people who care about the economy. And of course, we all care about the economy.
Well, Carville says the economy is stupid. And what strikes me about this is some of these economists are saying that inflation will shoot up like a rocket under Trump, whereas inflation has become kind of a major concern of those who are voting for Trump and voting against Harris. There are people feeling pocketbook on a daily basis.
No doubt about it. If you go out to eat, if you go to a grocery store, if you notice what you're paying for a can of a vegetable compared to what you paid for it 5 years ago, certainly 10 years ago, you're going to feel as though inflation is somehow out of control. And going out to eat is a way in which that's particularly true. Gas prices have moderated a bit in recent months, which is surprising given the situation in the Middle East. But nonetheless, it's not as bad as it was. And yet one need not tell anyone in California about high gas prices. And that makes life just plain difficult for a lot of Americans. They have to drive a long way to get to their job or to get home from their job to where they live. And that is It's a cutback in the quality of their life every time the price of gas goes up noticeably. And I mentioned groceries. There are lots of other things as well. So Americans are still suffering the inflation that, it seems to me, it's pretty obvious. It came from COVID. It came from the huge government spending programs that were done during COVID to support people's incomes and keep the economy from collapsing. That started when Trump was still president, went on with, real jets on it under Biden. And as a result, people associate it with the last several years. They remember Trump as the Trump before COVID. That's understandable. And they compare today and Trump pre-COVID, and they say, I was better off with Trump pre-COVID, but Trump. And as a result, they look at the current prices. They don't know that much about Kamala Harris, and they reach the conclusion that it makes sense for them to vote for Trump.
It's also, I think, baked into this is the sense that many people have that Kamala Harris is going to need Congress behind her if she's the president to get through a lot of these things that she's projecting and that she's putting forward, because they're going to be costly. And the same can be said for Trump with all of his ideas about deporting people who are already here, and that's pretty costly too. In other words, they're both going to not only incur some great costs in terms of what they're proposing, but they're both going to need Congress behind them. Let's talk about the House of Representatives first. I mean, the likelihood of the House of Representatives going Democratic depends a lot on where I am right here in California, doesn't it?
Yes, it does. It's remarkable, really. If the Democrats could flip every seat in California they've got a shot at, 5, 6, 7 seats, that right there, if everything else were equal in the other 49 states, would be enough to flip the House. Now, they probably won't run the table, but if turnout in California is as robust as it might be, as it could be, that could tip a few of those seats that went Republican in 2022. There were also Republican seats that went Republican in 2020, even as that same congressional district was voting for Joe Biden. Not a lot, but there were a few. And they didn't vote for Joe Biden by a lot, but they voted for Joe Biden. So to vote for Joe Biden and then vote for a Republican for Congress, it's not unheard of by any means. But it does make you a target in the next House election cycle. So there are several of those, as I say, in California. Almost a like number, 5 or 6, say, in New York, that also have gravitated to the Republicans over the last several years, since the last Democratic majority in the House. And any number of those could also be flipped by the Democrats. Now, I don't expect it to be all in one direction in either state. But that's a pretty strong start. Then there are some other seats the Democrats hope to pick up in the South because the Supreme Court has ruled that the gerrymandered legislative districts that were drawn by those legislatures for Congress as well as for their own state legislative seats were unconstitutional under decisions that really go back 60, 70 years. But of course, people are always trying to gerrymander to advance their own party's interests. We've seen it from both parties. And in the South, that was largely done by identity of race. So North Carolina kind of going the other way because the sorting out of their last map was they were allowed to gerrymander in such a way as to just make it be Democrats versus Republicans. The Supreme Court doesn't like to overturn partisan political gerrymanders, only racial gerrymanders. We saw a controversial case in South Carolina and so forth. So there may be some net gain for the Democrats in the South on that basis. And then it's slog it out, state after state, trying to fight through the political gerrymanders that we've found ourselves infested with in many states where legislatures were able to mount supermajorities to create maps where, take the state of Wisconsin, for example, the Democrats can win half the popular vote in the state of Wisconsin and only get 1 out of 3 seats in the state assembly. So you stop and think about that. I mean, you got to get an awful lot of votes to pull back to even if half the vote only gives you 1/3 of the seats. That's effective gerrymandering. That's state-of-the-art, AI, computer-driven, absolute perfection in gerrymandering. And we have it in several states, Wisconsin being one of them.
Indeed, we do. And also, it's very difficult to predict a lot of split tickets and a lot of down-ballot voting and how that's going to go and so forth. But you're saying, I think, the House could go either way, aren't you?
The House could go either way. It's probably, though, of the trifecta, it's probably the Democrats' best case right now on the numbers, state by state, district by district. There are about 24 or so toss-up seats, which, by the way, is not very many out of 435. That's how effective these mappings are. Most all the seats now are safe for one party or the other. But there are about 25, 26 thereabouts seats that could go either way. And maybe 14 of them are Republican and 12 are Democratic. So here again, as we could imagine somebody running the table in the presidential swing states, we could imagine somebody running the table with respect to those 26 seats, but it's not likely. And if the turnout is strong enough in blue states, the Democrats could be back in the majority and Hakeem Jeffries could be the next speaker. And a whole lot of people that we've been talking about a lot for the last couple of years will be a lot less important in that world. But the Senate looks like it's going the other way.
Well, let's talk about the Senate. But first, since you mentioned Speaker of the House, Mike Johnson is already at least getting some fights going, especially for committee head. I'm reading about Jim Jordan trying to get himself into head of a couple of committees and so forth. I mean, there's a lot of stuff going on right now before the election even takes place in terms of just positioning, chess games, all of that.
Yes, and from the perspective of those who expect Trump to win and who expect the Senate to be Republican, this is going to be a high time for Republicans, and particularly Republicans who identify with the MAGA movement, M-A-G-A, Make America Great Again. People who have felt as though the Republican Party has been too, hat in hand, too respectful of the Democrats, not willing to really put the pedal to the metal and push hard for really different policies at the federal level. And people are probably already familiar with Project 2025, which is a product of the Heritage Foundation. Donald Trump says he hasn't read it.
Yeah.
It's 900 pages, so I have no trouble believing that Trump hasn't read it. But it was put together by people who worked largely in the past for Trump and who have made no bounds about the fact that they see it as an agenda for a Trump restoration. So in that world, if you're Jim Jordan from Ohio and you have been important in right-wing Republican politics for years, he didn't win a vote for Speaker. He was a little too controversial, even in his own party, for that. But if Trump is back in the saddle, and if they've got the Senate and the House, then Jim Jordan wants to make sure that he's got as many gavels as possible so that he can have his moment. Even if he can't be Speaker, he can be a very powerful committee chairman in a Republican world of that description. Trump
back in power means retribution against his enemies, and the enemy within, as he defines those who are against him. It means anti-democracy. These are the things we're hearing from the Democrats, and the Republicans are saying hyperbole, over-exaggerated. Things will be pretty calm under Trump, much more than you assume from his rhetoric or from his media pronouncements on Truth Social.
That is what the Republicans running for other offices are saying. It's not what the Trump campaign is saying. The Trump campaign is saying, listen to what he says, take it seriously. What you see is what you get. And this will not be like the first Trump term. I don't believe, and now this is obviously just guesswork, but I would speculate Trump did not believe he was going to be president in 2016. The polls were all telling him he wouldn't be. It seemed like a bit of a stretch. He had other things in mind to do with his newfound celebrity and name recognition, had other plans business-wise. But when he became president, he tried to earn respectability by bringing on people in cabinet positions who were non-traditional, Republicans to be sure, but non-traditional people who had not spent their lives in politics, people who were certainly not right-wingers, and also by hiring a succession of, or at least his first couple, 3 chiefs of staff, he had 4 in all, were people who, could be seen as larger than politics, or at least as national Republicans with a moderate wing in their own thinking, as well as a MAGA wing or a Trump-like wing. So that went on for a couple of years or 3 years. But more and more, as those people left, as people like Nikki Haley bailed out on him, Trump turned to people that he could order around, people who were much more push button, and even chiefs of staff who would do whatever, like Mark Meadows, his last chief of staff, who would do whatever Trump asked them to do. And the sort of guardrails that have been set up by responsible folks like, well, for example, John Kelly, who's gotten so famous for his characterization of Trump now. John Kelly, they're not going to have any more John Kellys in a new Trump term. So I would certainly position myself somewhere between truly hyperbolic and hysterical reaction to the idea of another President Trump and might as well take him seriously. He's saying he wants to do these things and have this retribution and fire Jack Smith in 2 seconds and so on. He's saying it seriously, and we probably should take it just as seriously.
I always think of Maya Angelou's statement, trust people if they tell you what they're going to do. They really intend to do it in most cases, or they reveal themselves, at least in terms of their intentions and motivations. I'm just wondering your thoughts, Ron, about Judge Merchan and what role he might play in this. I mean, if Trump is elected, he can still be sentenced theoretically by Merchan. There's a lot of immunity around the Supreme Court and what they have essentially laid down. But at this point, it's so curious the way all these things are going away. Eileen Cannon now talk about the next attorney, her being the next attorney general. I still don't know what those things that turned up in his garage or wherever they were, as opposed to the ones in Biden. No, it was Biden's garage. It was in his Mar-a-Lago place. I'm talking about actually documents that were high security, and I wonder what he was doing with them to begin with. You might ask the same question about Biden, but I think the question is more appropriate for Donald Trump. So everything's going to just go away if he's elected, literally go away?
Not necessarily automatically.
I mean, he said he's going to fire Jack Smith, right? In 2 seconds.
In 2 seconds, yeah. And of course, Jack Smith works for the Justice Department, and as of January 20th at noon, Trump would be the president again, and he would have the power to fire anybody in the Justice Department. There will be a fracas over it, of course, and there will be much discussed, but he would have literally the power to do it or just shut down his case, in which case Jack Smith would probably just resign. As respect to judges, though, especially state judges, that's a little trickier. And we haven't had a lot of cases of presidents being prosecuted by state courts. And it would seem that the mood of the Supreme Court is that the president shouldn't be messed with, that the president cannot be prosecuted for doing what's part of his job. Now, Judge Merchan might very well claim that all those things that New York did and that Trump was convicted of by a jury, 34 counts, all those frauds were not in any way, shape, or form part of the president's core responsibilities, to use the language of the Supreme Court. And so that case might very well go all the way back up to the Supreme Court. Can he still be prosecuted at the state level? He can't pardon himself at the state level, even if he can at the federal level, and that's never been determined either. He has asserted that he could pardon himself for his crimes at the federal level, but we don't know that because we've never seen a president try it.
It's all up in the air, but I think Merchan could actually put him in jail even if he's elected president, theoretically, I think.
It's conceivable he could do it before January 20th.
Yeah. Now, what do you think is going to happen? Let me just take a couple of Senate races and get your thoughts. There's talk that Allred is creeping up on Cruz, and actually Ted Cruz may be defeated. Is that the way you see it?
Well, the Democratic Senatorial Campaign Committee has just decided to commit a big chunk, millions of dollars more, into Texas in a last-minute push to help Colonel Allred, former Dallas Cowboys linebacker and member of Congress, the Democrat against Ted Cruz, over the top. Ted Cruz always seems to come up with what he needs in the last moment in these races. He survived 6 years ago when he looked like a goner. So this is probably not the Democrats' best chance to, let's put it this way. The Democrats don't have a lot of places to try to flip seats in this election cycle because most of the seats that are on the ballot in the 6-year cycles don't correspond to presidential cycles perfectly. Most of the seats that are on the ballot in this cycle are held by Democrats, or they're held by Republicans in such deep red states that they're not in any kind of danger. We sort of thought Ted Cruz was in that category, but Cruz has done some things in recent years that make him less popular in Texas. That little trip he took to Cancun when the rest of the state was undergoing a power outage in the winter. He's made some missteps and is not the most popular person in the world. But most of the focus here, I think, is on the Democrats who are trying to hold on desperately. They're in very, very close races. in a number of states, Ohio, Wisconsin, and in Pennsylvania even, where Bob Casey is having a tough time holding off his millionaire opponent. These are going to be tough races for the Democrats to bring home. And even then, they're probably going to lose the majority because they're going to lose in Montana, and West Virginia is pretty much already gone. The incumbent didn't run for re-election. It's a real tough layout for the Democrats in the Senate, and they really only have a bare nominal majority there now, not a true majority.
You mentioned Montana. What's interesting about that is Tester's been an incumbent for quite a while, but Tom Sheehy, who's running against him, has had a recent scandal. He talked about getting wounded in, I think, Afghanistan or in combat at any rate, and it turned out he shot himself. I mean, I don't know how these impact these things have anymore, but it seemed to me maybe significant.
It could be significant, and probably if it had been brought up sooner, it might have had a little bit more impact. Tester's a tough guy, and he has hung on, as you say, through several cycles. He has hung on some tough elections in the past and has, I think, a good relationship with regular Montana voters. The problem is that the Democratic Party has just seriously deteriorated in its claims on the voting people of Montana. Montana's a state that regularly elected 2 Democrats to the Senate for decades, generations, including some really iconic people like Mike Mansfield, who was a longtime Democratic leader, back in the time of the Civil Rights Act. Just really big name people from Montana who were Democrats. And they've had some populist Democrats in recent years who were very popular. And one of them was John Tester. But after the years go by, and when the state has so fallen for Donald Trump, and he's double digits and more, huge leads in Montana in the last 2 elections, and he's going to win Montana big again. You're asking so many people to split their ticket. It's going to be tough for Tester.
What about Sherrod Brown in Ohio? Go to my home state just for a moment, get your thoughts. He's running a difficult, I think it's the most expensive campaign of them all in this country, isn't it?
It is this time around. We've seen just astonishing amounts of money spent on Senate campaigns in recent cycles, all thanks, of course, to Citizens United opening the floodgates on not only corporate money, but individuals who choose to come in and spend unlimited amounts. I think a lot of people thought Sherrod Brown was living on borrowed time. Last time around, 6 years ago, he is a progressive Democrat in a state that has become increasingly red. And in recent cycles, it's been very tough for Democrats. Obama did win it twice, but apart from that, it's been swinging Republican for a number of years.
It's a red state now. It really is a red state.
It is now really a red state. I mean, it's a 7-8 point Trump lead right now in Ohio. I believe I'm pretty sure this is right, in 2020, I think that the percentage for Trump in Ohio was a little higher than it was in Texas. So if we accept Texas is still a red state and probably will be for the foreseeable future, we're going to have to pretty much come to terms with that as being true of Ohio as well. And that's how we got J.D. Vance, by the way, who would not even be in the Senate if it weren't for that kind of big swing in the Republican direction in that state. And of course, just after 2 years of being in the Senate now, he's going to be vice president. And he's going to be vice president if Trump wins. And if he wins, you've got a 78-year-old man there and J.D. Vance right behind him. So that's a very rapid rise for J.D. Vance, and it happened in Ohio.
Ever going to get money out of politics? Is that just a pipe dream? I'm talking even about a diminution of money in politics because it's central. It's what makes politics go in this country. It's what makes lobbyists go. It's what makes legislation go. Everything is based on money.
Michael, everything the government does affects money and affects how much money this group of people or that group of people have or get to keep or how they make it. Virtually everything the government does has some effect or demands a certain amount of money to be expended by somebody. And, when you talk about national defense, that's a huge part of the economy. Talking about national defense, you're talking about a huge part of the tax effort by American citizens is to pay for the military, pay for national defense. Any issue you want to bring up is going to have economic implications. And so to tell people they can't spend money to affect what the government decides, that's going to be pretty tough to enforce. So we had made a lot of progress in the latter part of the 20th century, in the 70s and again in the 90s and early part of the 2000s, in passing legislation that at least tried to put some restraint and some limitation on who and how much. But then all that got blown up.
Excuse me, Ron, I always think of McCain-Feingold. That was, it was really incremental.
Yeah, that was after 2000.
Yeah.
That happened after a big scandal in the energy field. I think it was the Enron Corporation. And that shocked enough people that that legislation got passed. It was bipartisan. John McCain, a Republican, Russ Feingold, a Democrat. They got that done. And then very soon thereafter, the lawsuits and the Supreme Court decisions began to pile up. And now we are where we are, which is pretty close to back to the 1890s. And, the golden rule being he who has the gold makes the rules.
One last question, and it's a little bit frivolous in some ways, but nevertheless, it's been in my mental craw. How much do celebrities really affect an election of this sort? I mean, the Democrats have all the power there, in terms of the stellar figures, including Obama, but I'm thinking about Beyonce and Taylor Swift and Eminem and Springsteen. What do you think?
Enthusiasm matters. And especially now when we get to the end of a long slog like this and everyone's exhausted, if you can use the Springsteens and the Taylor Swifts to bring out a huge crowd and make them enthusiastic and have them going crazy for you, you're going to look better than if you're just walking out on that stage by yourself. And so in that sense, because celebrities have so much ability to generate interest and generate excitement and emotion, they can be a huge boon.
Well, before I thank you officially, Ron, let me thank all who joined us for this episode of Gray Matter with Michael Krasny. And you can listen to us on Apple, Spotify, or at our website at graymatter.show. If you haven't yet become a member of the podcast, again, I invite you to join by going to the website at graymatter.show, and you can find previous episodes there. And I also invite you to mail any reactions or suggestions you may have to me at mkrasny@graymatter.show. And I want to thank our terrific team, Alex, Shannon, Chad, Kevin, Jeff, Colleen, and Tanya. And a special thanks to this week's guest, my friend and former colleague, Ron Elving. Can I call you one of the goats of political analysis?
Gracious.
One of the greatest of all time.
Goodness gracious.
Yeah. No, really always enjoy talking to you and learn so much from you. Thank you, Ron.
Well, it's been a great pleasure for me, Michael. Thank you.
I'm Michael Krasny.
Bandwidth for Gray Matter is provided by CashFly at CACHEFLY.com.